Okay, so we need to finish up section 2 here just briefly. There's a small section left to cover, and then we'll move into section 3. So, excuse me, by 1949, the lines of the Cold War were clearly drawn. Europe was divided between the communist East and capitalist West. The two sides carried out the Cold War through economic policy, diplomatic actions, propaganda, espionage, and secret operations. This is where we really start to see the CIA carry out covert operations in other countries. Although the superpowers, being the US and the Soviet Union, never engaged in direct shooting war, the threat of violence was always present. In 1949, the Western Allies formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This group, which included the US, Canada, and Western European nations, was dedicated to mutual defense. Members agreed to treat an attack on one country as an attack on all. 6 years later, in 1955, the Soviet Union formed its own defense alliance, the Warsaw Pact, which included the nations of Eastern Europe. These mutual defense pacts revealed the rising military tensions between East and West. They also reflected the threat posed by nuclear weapons. The U.S. had used the atomic bomb against Japan in 1945. Just 4 years later, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic bomb. By the early 1950s, both superpowers had developed a more powerful nuclear device called the hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb for short. By the 1960s, they had created long-range missiles called intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, which could carry nuclear warheads to targets a whole continent away. The superpowers had become engaged in an expensive and deadly arms race. This competition over weaponry stoked fears of nuclear war and raised the stakes in the superpower conflict. The US and the Soviet Union also got involved in a space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. You can see a replica of that, guys, if you ever go to Washington, D.C. and go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. If you're looking for a good movie, too, October Sky is a good movie based during this time period. A few months later, the U.S. put its own satellite into space. In 1961, the Soviet Union sent the first human into orbit, followed soon after by the first American astronaut. In 1969, the U.S. landed the first men on the moon. The space race was another costly form of superpower competition, but it also brought important advances in science and technology. The Cold War continued for more than 40 years. During that time, the superpowers sought to dominate each other and bring less powerful nations over to their side. The US and the Soviet Union were not the only major players in the Cold War. Another important actor, in fact, was China. So now we're going to move into section 3, China's communist path. After World War II, China was torn by civil war. Nationalists fought with communists for control of the country. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, eventually won. In 1949, they founded the People's Republic of China, and that's what we have in the world today. The nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan, where they formed their own government. And guys, this is really interesting to note that China today still does not recognize the legitimacy of Taiwan's government because of that revolution or civil war in China. The triumph of communism in China took both the US and the USSR by surprise. They had assumed that the nationalists would defeat Mao's forces. At first, American officials held out hope that China would reject Soviet influence and remain neutral in the Cold War. However, Mao soon sided with the Soviet Union. In February of 1950, he and Stalin sealed their alliance by signing a mutual defense pact. Communist states now ruled a vast portion of Eurasia from Eastern Europe to the East China Sea. This made the U.S. and its Western allies really, really nervous. The balance of power in Eurasia was clearly tilting towards the communists. Over the next few years, Mao consolidated his control over China and expanded China's borders. In 1950, Chinese forces invaded and occupied Tibet, a land with a long history of Chinese influence. China also threatened to invade Taiwan, where those nationalists fled to, and take control of the island. The U.S. intervened and provided military aid and assistance to defend Taiwan and its nationalist government. So what we start seeing in world conflicts and politics here is people are either allying with the Soviet Union or the United States. And oftentimes, if either side saw the potential for what their type of government was, if they saw the potential for that to fall, that's when they would step in and try and assist. So both the Soviet Union and the United States had assumed that the nationalists would defeat Mao's forces. The U.S. hoped that China would reject Soviet influence because they were really scared of the growing strength of communism. And again, after Mao and Stalin signed that Mutual Defense Pact, the balance of power in Eurasia was clearly tilting towards communism. So meanwhile, Mao sought to strengthen communist rule in China. He placed power in the hands of the Communist Party and then began to restructure the economy based on Marxist principles. Remember, Karl Marx was the father of communism and believed that ultimately we would have a classless society. No rich, no poor, everybody's equal. But the character of Chinese communism was different from Soviet communism. Mao and his followers believed that peasants, not urban workers, were the revolutionary class. So in China you have like peasants would be like the farm workers and those kind of people that Mao believed would overtake China. The first step was to organize Chinese agriculture along socialist lines. In 1950, the government passed a land reform law, breaking up large estates and distributing land to poor peasants. These small plots were soon combined into larger collective farms, which in theory would be more efficient. A few years later, the government followed the Soviet model of development by setting up even larger collective farms called communes, where private property was abolished and production goals were set by the state. Chinese women were granted equal rights and given a greater role in production. The government also socialized industry, putting most factories under state ownership. In 1953, it began a 5-year plan designed to modernize the country and to increase industrial production. The plan was a success. Industrial output doubled, with the greatest gains in steel and other heavy industries. But these results just did not seem to satisfy Mao. In 1958, he announced a new plan called the Great Leap Forward. This plan set higher targets for both agriculture and industry. Farmers were forced to work on large rural projects and create their own backyard industries to produce steel and other goods. And literally, guys, what a backyard industry is they had to create these things in their own backyards. The plan was an absolute disaster. Farming suffered and food production fell sharply. By 1961, some 30 million Chinese had died of starvation. This is the largest famine in human history, and it happened 50 years ago. So, looking at our notes document, Mao restructured the Chinese economy based on Marxist principles. He abolishes private land ownerships, creates collective farms, and he puts most factories under state control. That Great Leap Forward was Mao's plan for greater agricultural and industrial output. It did not achieve anything except for 30 million deaths in China, the largest famine in human history. Because it led to decreased production. The land that we farm can only handle so much. And when you suck the nutrients dry out of the land that you're trying to farm, out of the soil, food can't grow. And so your production decreases. The amount of food that you can harvest from the land decreases, therefore leaving less food for people to consume, and people die, obviously, as a result of that. The failure of the Great Leap Forward damaged Mao's reputation both at home and abroad. Relations with the USSR became strained after Stalin's death in 1953. Under Stalin's successor Nikita Khrushchev, the USSR, Soviet Union, rejected the murderous violence and repression that had characterized the Stalin era. Meanwhile, the Chinese continued to laud Stalin as a hero. So what we're seeing is a change in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union starts to shift course. They reject the things that Stalin did. He was terrible to his people. He was killing all of his enemies. The Great Leap, or the 5-year plan that he instituted, caused famine. So China continues to think Stalin was just so amazing, but the Soviet Union kind of pulls back from that. The Soviet Union chose to distance itself further, cutting off aid to China and ultimately ending their alliance. Mao's image also suffered in China. Facing mounting criticism, he stepped down as head of state and allowed other leaders to set policy. The government launched a program of economic reform, making investments in agriculture and industry and shutting down many state enterprises. Within a few years, the economy began to recover. Mao regarded these new policies as a betrayal of communism. He accused reformers of promoting capitalist values, and he claimed the Communist Party had lost touch with the people. So, in 1966, Mao calls on students to revive China's revolutionary spirit. Radical student groups known as the Red Guards took to the streets demanding a return to communist ideals. China was soon engulfed in a wave of revolutionary turmoil that ended up being called the Cultural Revolution. It was just a period, I shouldn't say just, it was a pretty big deal. It was a period of revolutionary upheaval and political persecution from 1966 to 1976. With Mao's blessing, the Red Guards persecuted or attacked anyone they considered anti-revolutionary. Targets of violence included party members, government officials, artists, intellectuals, and others who were said to embrace quote-unquote old ideals. Many people were beaten or jailed, and up to 1 million were killed. Rival armed groups began to fight pitched battles in the streets. The country was on the verge of civil war. So that Great Leap Forward fails. It led to criticisms of Mao. He steps down as head of state, but views policies set by other leaders as a betrayal of communism. So this is how that Great Leap Forward led to the Cultural Revolution. He calls on students, or the future of China, to revive China's revolutionary spirit. So now we're going to talk, we've already kind of talked about what happened during the Cultural Revolution, but basically what we're seeing is these rival armed groups basically putting China on the verge of a civil war. So Mao and other top officials step in to restore order because this is actually really shocking to them. In 1968, the Red Guards were officially disbanded. The most extreme phase of the Cultural Revolution was over by the following year. However, political struggles continued until Mao's death in 1976. New leaders eventually took over and introduced reforms, but China remained a communist state, and actually, again, still does today. So that's what I have for you for Section 3. The next video will be Section 4, which is Cold War conflicts. So we're going to learn about Korea and Vietnam and the event that some people consider the closest that the world ever got to nuclear war.